15 months ago, I made the announcement that I was moving from full-frame Pentax to micro four thirds with the Panasonic Lumix G9.
In this episode, I'm going to talk about why I've gone from this to this.
And I thought it was about time that I did a review and tell you what I think of it, the likes and the dislikes. Well, firstly, ergonomics. I was used to the Pentax K1 and before that the K3, K5 and K20D cameras, all of which had really good ergonomics. And in fact, the Pentax K1 is still the best camera that I've ever used in terms of feel in the hand. But second best is this. I'm really happy with this camera. The grip is nice and deep. It allows me to grab the camera easily with my whole hand. I don't have to have the little finger falling off the bottom of it. Some people have suggested that you use the battery grip on it to give you a bigger grip. One of the reasons I went to this camera was to get a lighter camera setup, and so adding that battery grip would just add extra weight to me, but it sits comfortably in my hand, so I'm impressed with that. The buttons and the wheels and things are all within easy use. The ergonomic setup of the camera is really good. One of the things that took me a little while to get used to was this front wheel. The front wheel on this camera is on top of the camera. I'd been used to the Pentax cameras where the front wheel surrounded the shutter button, which for me was a much more natural place for my forefinger to sit. But this now is a very easy place for me to automatically drop my fingers on. The wheels at the back and the focusing button on the back are all within easy movement of my thumb without me having to jump over this little grip, which incidentally is a really nice feature. A lot of cameras don't bother about the back of the camera for grip, they just use the front grip for it, but this little thumb rest on the back of the camera sits really well. One of the things that people have commented on a lot about ease of use of this camera and ergonomics is the hair trigger shutter. Yes, it is the lightest touch shutter that I've ever used, but you get used to it. But I'm really not that concerned about it for my style of shooting, because if I'm hand holding the camera, I'm almost always using back button focus, and I turn off the focus on the shutter button. And so I don't have to worry about that. And then secondly, if I'm using the camera on a tripod, I'm almost always using a remote release. So I'm very rarely worried about the half depression for the focus becoming a full depression for releasing the shutter. The other thing that I find really useful in terms of ease of use is the number of customizable buttons on here. There are 5 customizable buttons that you can use on the body of the camera, and there are also a number of other customizable buttons that you can use with the screen, and it's just a single touch to turn those on or off. I use this little flip lever at the front for switching between single shot and a 7-shot bracket, which gives me really quick access to that if I'm not sure about the exposure that I need to shoot. One of the things that I was concerned about before I looked at mirrorless cameras was switching from a normal viewfinder in an SLR to an electronic viewfinder. Everybody had said that electronic viewfinders have a lag, they're not as good, you can't see what's going on as easily and so on. I'm really impressed with the electronic viewfinder of this camera, and in fact that was one of the reasons that I went for this camera over some of the Olympus cameras that I had the option of. The EVF on this camera is fast, it's bright, there's almost no lag, and in fact I can't discern any lag, and I'm really impressed with it. I've effectively stopped using the loop that I used to use on the back of my other cameras, where I would put it over the LCD screen to get close-up views because the EVF in this is good enough for me to magnify the view either before taking the shot or in reviewing the shot to be able to check for particularly sharp focus. Just a little thing, but one of the things that I really found really useful in this is having a 60-second shutter option available just within the normal settings. Most cameras will only allow you to go down to 30 seconds. This one allows 60 seconds, and I've found that it's really useful. That extra stop of light without having to switch over to bulb and then fiddle around with bulb settings has made it really good to use in low light situations and where I want to have a slower shutter speed than 30 seconds. The other thing from ease of use that I really like this camera with, and it was a hangover from what I required with moving away from Pentax, is a really good menu. Pentax has a really good menu structure. Many other cameras that I've used, the menu structures are complex, they're unintuitive, but that's not the case for the Lumix one. And in fact, there are two really nice features on this. One is the quick menu, a single button that you can press, and that will show you most of the camera settings on the LCD screen, and you can just jump between those really quickly without having to change the display settings to get access to those things. And the second one in the menu structure itself is a custom menu, a personalised custom menu that allows you to choose the custom settings that you want to have quick access to. So with 2 clicks on the menu, I can get access to the 10 things that I use really frequently. And that makes it a really useful way of jumping back to the menus to get to the things that I want to be able to do without having to remember which sub-menu that they're sitting in. The thing that I'm most impressed by this camera with, though, is its stabilization. I thought the stabilization, the in-body stabilization on the Pentax K1 was very good. It gave me 2 or 3 extra stops in terms of being able to hand hold. This one, I think, is 6 or 7. It claims to be 6 or 7 stops, and I think that's about right. I can hand hold this on a 12mm lens at 1 second and get most of the shots acceptably sharp. Every now and then I get an exceptionally sharp one, but I very rarely get a blurry one if I'm using good hand-holding technique at 1 second. I took a shot of a superb fairy wren out the window of the car with the car engine running at 60th of a second with an 800mm full-frame equivalent lens. I couldn't imagine doing that with any other camera. So that's probably the biggest bonus that I've found in hand-holding this camera, particularly on shooting wildlife. The other reason that I was going away from the Pentax cameras is because the video on them is really pretty ordinary. They really haven't kept up with video on many other platforms. Suffice to say that I'm really happy with the video on this camera. It's exceptionally good quality, and it's really intuitive to use. Combined with the stabilization, it means that I can hand hold a lot of video shots of birds and trees and so on without having to worry about stabilizing the camera too much. And the other thing that I really like is a single button that I can click over to. And in fact, the way I have the camera set up is when I'm using normal video, I don't switch to the video mode, I just use the video start button, which allows me to use the video in whatever setup I've got the rest of the camera in. But I switch to the video mode and I have that set up for the extra slow motion at 180 frames per second. And having that one click to go to 180 frames per second video is really useful. If I'm shooting video, I can be set up in my normal stills mode, single press on the red video button and I'm shooting video, stop that, and then instantly switch over to 180 frames per second without having to bounce through menus and so on. So really happy with that too. One of the things that I was concerned about when I read all the reviews of Panasonic Lumix cameras was their ability to fast focus. Some people have said that the focusing system in Lumix cameras is not as good as it is in Olympus. I can't tell because I've never used Olympus and I've only really played with them for a few minutes in a store. I haven't actually gone out and used them in the field. So I'm not going to dispute that. But certainly from Pentax, the focusing on this is a vast improvement. I really like the different focusing screen setups that you can use, in particular the pinpoint focus that I mentioned in my very first video. that enables me to get really quick, sharp focus on the exact point, not just a square to focus on inside the viewfinder. And the other one that I'm finding really useful is the tracking focus. It works really nicely, and the face focusing and animal focusing seems to work very well. I really want to do more testing of the animal focusing to see how well that works, but at the moment the only thing I've got to work with is my cats and dog in the backyard, and they're not terribly cooperative, so I'll really look to use that in a zoo to test out, but I can't get out to zoos at the moment. And the last thing that I'm really happy with, and the thing that many people were concerned about when they were talking about why to go or not to go to Micro Four Thirds cameras, is the lenses. Now, while that's not a review of the camera, obviously the lenses are important in terms of the use of the camera. I'm very happy with the quality of the lenses and the variety of lenses. And I'll do another review on my setup that I'll talk about the different lenses that I use. But suffice to say that with the Micro Four Thirds platform enabling you to go between different platforms of lenses, I can switch between Panasonic lenses, Olympus lenses, and obviously third-party lenses that are manufactured for the Micro Four Thirds platform. And I really like that. I actually use one Olympus lens, and I'll talk about that one in the next video. But I'm happy with the quality of the lenses and the ease of use of the lenses, and the dual stabilization for the high quality lenses that have got stabilization built into the lens and the stabilization in the camera is just fantastic. Okay, anything I dislike about this camera? Not much. The two things that I was concerned about that most people talk about are the shortcomings of Micro Four Thirds cameras. The small sensor size and low light performance. Now, they were something that I already knew about, and they were compromises that I was willing to make when I moved over to this system. But after using the camera and lenses for 15 months now, what do I think about those? Well, firstly, I very rarely need more than the 20 megapixels that's in here. Yes, it's nice to have the extra megapixels, particularly if you're going to be cropping. And there are always going to be occasions where I want to crop on wildlife shots, and often on close-up or macro shots where I just can't get close enough in to the actual subject to get the full frame for the subject. So I want to crop later. One of the things that you can do with this camera, though, is to use the 80 megapixel high resolution mode. Yes, it's not useful in circumstances where you've got a lot of movement of the subject, but in cases where you've got a still subject, it works exceptionally well. And I've used it with some focus stacking in close-up or macro shots with some really good results. Let's compare a normal resolution 20 megapixel file with a high resolution 80 megapixel file. And I've got Lightroom set to fit the images in the frame, so you can't tell the difference, they're identical. But let's look at what happens if we zoom in to 1:1. This straight raw file out of the camera gives us a great amount of detail on the normal resolution. But if we go into the 80 megapixel file, you can see that there's an extraordinary amount of detail that comes out of it. Remember, this is a straight raw file. And let's have a look at what happens with just a little bit of processing. And again, if we zoom into 1:1, how much detail we can get out of that image. The second thing was the low light. How well does the camera operate in low light? One of the first trips I took with this camera to shoot wildlife, I was shooting before sunrise at ISO 1600, and I got some pretty good results. Here's a shot taken at ISO 1600. It was in really dark conditions before sunrise, and if we zoom into the water in the background, you can see there is a little bit of grainy noise here, but that's really easily dealt with in post-production. And here's the final version of this, and you can see that that noise has completely disappeared with just a little bit of manipulation in Lightroom and Photoshop. The other times that I bump the ISO up are when I need a really fast shutter speed in normal lighting conditions. And that's when I'm shooting things like birds in flight, and I want to shoot at something like a 1/2000th of a second or even faster, and I need to bump the ISO up to 3200. I'm perfectly happy shooting at 3200 in good light and at ISO 1600 in low light conditions. Now that's not as high ISO as I was used to using on the K1, but it's a reasonable compromise. And the software to remove noise these days is so good that you can really get an exceptional quality image out of something that was much noisier than you thought you were going to be able to use, certainly than you could use a few years ago. So, did I make a mistake in going to this camera? No, I didn't. Of course, people will say, you're never going to admit that you were wrong, having spent thousands of dollars on a new kit, but I kept my Pentax cameras when I was going to change over, that I would keep them for between 6 and 12 months to decide whether I wanted to make the change or go back to the Pentax cameras. I sold my last Pentax lens a month ago. I'm really happy with this kit, with the setup, with the weight. I can now carry a camera, 4 or 5 lenses, and a bunch of other gear in the same bag that I used to have less equipment but heavier equipment. If I want to, I can shrink the kit down to something that easily fits within the weight limits of carry-on most aeroplanes. And I can even get a smaller kit if I just want to do some walk around without having to carry the full backpack of gear around with me. And I'll talk more about that in a subsequent video when I look at how I've set up my camera bag and my kit now using the Panasonic Lumix system. So, if you've liked this video, please like, subscribe, click the little bell to get notified when I make new videos. Tell your friends, repost, do whatever you want to do. But remember, pixels are free, so get out there and shoot more, at least when you're able to, and hopefully that won't be too far away. So bye for now.